I read a lot of books and I know a lot about Genesis. And so if I were to spend money on a book that doesn't teach me anything new, I'd be disappointed. And I wasn't disappointed in this book. I'm not disappointed in this book. If you don't want to watch the whole video, just click the link below and order this book because it's great. Hello and welcome to another episode of Everything Phil Collins. And today we're talking about a book. We're going to do a little book review on this great book called Genesis Reference Manual 1965 to 2022 by Alan Hewitt. So a little bit of background. This came out at the end of 2022. I believe I got it in early 2023. But it may have been shipping in December of 2022. I can't confirm that. It's from Weimer Publishing. And Alan has written, I believe he's written other books. I definitely know he's written one called Opening the Musical Box in 2001. First of all, I'll say I read a lot of books and I get frustrated when a book that I'm reading or I've paid money for doesn't teach me anything new. I also know a lot about Genesis, and I've read a certain amount of books about Genesis and magazines about Genesis and documentaries about Genesis and interviews. So it's quite challenging for a book to teach me something new. And I will say many times in almost every chapter, I heard a new perspective or a new anecdote, especially in the early days. And that's one of the things I'm really, really happy about with this book is sometimes it's like, are we going to hear the same old stories? I was talking to John Edgington when we did the interview, who's the director of the Genesis documentary, Some of the Parts. And I was telling him how fans of Genesis especially, but fans of Phil Collins and fans of Genesis are just like hungry dogs looking for new information, looking for new demos or remixes or new releases or bootlegs or even just anecdotes and stories. That's why John's raw videos of interviews with Phil and the band is so valuable because we get to hear new things we've never heard before. So I found there was a lot in this book that I didn't know before, just little stuff. And of course, one of the things I love about this book is how it compiles a lot of interviews. And so you can go through and listen to interviews on YouTube that have been ripped from, all the way back into the late 60s or certainly the early 70s, all the way up until now. And you can be like, I've heard that anecdote there. I've heard that there. So it's kind of nice to have them consolidated a little bit here and taking the relevant quotes for each album or for each event in the band's history. That's what I really like this book for. There were two magazines that came out recently that I read. This one, first of all, was one of my favorites. It was huge. Who did this? This was Uncut magazine, and this went album by album. It was a whole magazine dedicated to them. If you ever get a copy of this, it's phenomenal. And then this one that just came out a couple of months ago, which was also pretty good, and it kind of a different from a more of a collector's perspective. What I like about these magazines, of course, you don't learn a ton new, maybe a little bit, but it's just kind of relaxing. And I mean, like for a nerd who has a YouTube channel dedicated to Phil Collins, I like to, lay in bed at night and just read magazines about them. And so this book checks those boxes for me. So when I was opening the box, it took a little while to get here over into Canada as I ordered it directly from the publisher. And as I was opening the box, I kind of didn't know what this was at the time. And I wasn't expecting it to be so big because it kind of looked almost like a vinyl box. But then again, it wasn't perfectly square. And I was really surprised at how big this book is. Can you see that? This is like 8.25 inches by 11 and 3/4 inches. So this is like a university textbook. In fact, when I pulled it out, my wife made fun of me because it was like Genesis reference manual. And she's like, what do you need a reference manual for? It really is like a textbook. And I'll tell you, for a nerd who has a YouTube channel about Genesis and Phil Collins, I do need a reference manual, but the size was a shocker. And I'll tell you why, and I'm going to go through the pros and cons of this book in a second. But you need the size to be big because you have big ads, right? You have big newspaper clippings. And so it's really important that you can see that. And we'll talk about those in a minute. But there's really cool things that you want to see in large format. So the content of the book is laid out such as this. Basically, you're starting with this history. Oh my gosh, look at this. Isn't this cool stuff here? So you're starting with this history, and it basically goes the beginning, the forming of the band at Charterhouse, some of the history of the guys, and then it essentially goes album by album. And even the bigger parts of the story, like Peter leaving and Steve leaving, is kind of shoehorned into what album that happened around. There's some fantastic cutouts in here, which we'll talk about in a minute. After it discusses all of the albums, there's also some other things it talks about, like the 2007 tour. It obviously talks about calling all stations. It doesn't leave that out, which is great. It talks about the 2021 and 2022 tour, which is really cool. It talks really briefly about John's documentary, which I just mentioned. There's this great chronology of basically everything that happened from like when the band formed to when people were born to when a single came out. And it's like 6 or 7 pages long. It's massive. It goes from the early 60s all the way up until the last entry is March 26, 2022, the final show in London. So really fantastic. There's some information about tour programs, and it shows a little bit about that. I haven't gotten this deep into it where they're talking about books. And then, of course, we list the discography, and it's like everything in different countries and when the remasters, reissues. That's where it becomes like a textbook. That's where it becomes a reference manual. And I think I appreciate that. One of the things I would not appreciate about a book such as this, especially something that's titled a reference manual, that's a resource and it's not somebody's autobiography. But one of the things I would really hope to find is the absence of editorial commentary or any sort of author bias. And I can say that there are few and far between examples of the author showing his own preferences or his own biases towards certain songs or certain albums or certain eras. That'd be a big deal breaker for me if somebody was just completely slagging off Invisible Touch. We don't really need an author's opinions. We have those opinions. And I would say, of the times I could count on one hand in this book where he offers his own opinion, he will be very clear in stating that it is his opinion, that it's the editor's or the author's opinion, which I think is really important to do. And like only half of the times is it negative and half the times it's positive. So it's definitely not this case of somebody claiming to say that, and we've seen this before, where trying to say that Invisible Touch is objectively worse than The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. Of course, a lot of people feel that way, but it's technically not an objective opinion. So you don't really need an author to say that. You can talk about how critics didn't like a certain song and how it seems like the consensus of the fans don't like a certain song. But interjecting an author's critique or bias or personal tastes is not really helpful for me as a reader. And I can say that I was really pleasantly surprised that that didn't happen a lot in this book, if at all. I mean, even the times it did, it's very, very tame. And I mean, he has the right to. It's his book. Obviously, I do on this channel, but it's just a YouTube channel. You would think that something called a reference manual be held to a different standard. And so that's one of the things I really love about this book. Let's talk about the pros and cons real quick. Pros is I learn new things. I can't think of an example because I've been plowing through this. But yeah, there's just parts of the early story that maybe, I would say there's parts of every album too that are just not very clickbaity when it comes to including them in a magazine or in an article. And so we don't maybe get to hear these stories. But because he's done his research and he's talked to certain people, we hear like little tidbits about making these certain albums that are just kind of boring to everybody else. But to us, they're really fascinating. And so that's where I learn new things, is in some of just the really fine details. It's also, for me, it's great to have a textbook resource. I kind of feel like I need that. And so that's one of the reasons I really like it. And I was shocked at the size, and now I appreciate it. The other pro is, like I mentioned, is some of the photos. There's tons of press clippings, which is really cool, and some really cool collectible items that you just don't get to see very often. And I like that. I think that's really, really cool. Some personal handwritten notes, some tour posters, and some magazine posters. Like that's one of my favorite thing is like when the band would take out an ad to advertise A Trick of the Tail or to advertise a new single. It's really cool to see those. Also has a picture of my wife in there. Okay, let's talk about the cons. I don't have a lot of cons, but for the sake of this video, I'm going to come up with some cons. First of all, the pictures are hard to see. And I think that that's kind of, let me see if I can give you an example. So, I mean, in some cases, like the text on this is too small, you can't read it. And I don't have a problem with that. I mean, I probably could get a magnifying glass, or I could probably look up the article myself. That's not what I have a problem with. Sometimes it's more of an issue of the contrast. And I think the reason being is because of the paper quality. And I think ultimately, you have to keep the cost down, right? And so if you were to boost the contrast of every single ticket stub and every single photo, it would be really hard to do. And the other thing is you don't really know how it's going to turn out. So you could boost the contrast or the exposure of certain things, but then it may be too bright and it may not be readable. And so there are times where this, for example, here could stand to be boosted a little bit. But again, you don't really know how it's going to turn out on the page. And if you're trying to keep the cost down, the pages are matte. They're slightly translucent, so they're not going to take on that much ink. And I forgive all of these things because Genesis isn't as big as the Beatles. Some of you will be upset that I say that, but they're not as big as the Beatles or as big as the Rolling Stones that would justify a big coffee table book with really heavy-duty pages. With extremely vibrant color images and scans. That would be really nice to have. I have a couple of those coffee table books for Johnny Cash and for other artists that I've seen in bookstores. But those books need to sell thousands and thousands of copies. And so if you're doing a low run and you want to keep the costs down, because I think for me, after shipping, I was like over $60 Canadian. So you're trying to keep the cost down because we're already at like almost 400 pages. The contrast of the images made it a little bit hard to see. The scans weren't perfect, but I just can't blame them for that because I wouldn't have wanted to pay like $150 for this if it was in full color or a heavier, glossier paper. The other thing I'll add is the formatting is a bit off. And by that, I mean, the biggest example would be because it's such a big book. If you look at this, we have like a really big sea of text. I don't know if you can see that okay. Now, this isn't all the time. This is very rare that you would have a full spread of text. And so sometimes you would maybe want to break this up with some subheadings or increase the spacing between the lines or behind the lines, if you will. The other thing I would suggest here is wider margins so that the eye is given more white space. You know, it's just a relaxing read when there's like a bigger margin. If you look at any kind of novel, there's usually some pretty fat margins around the block of text. And so this makes it a little hard to read. I was reading in bed last night and you're kind of like reading like a typewriter because the pages are so big and the text is so wide. Now, again, I'll tell you what, if we were to shrink this down, if we were to increase the spacing, and if we were to significantly increase the margin, then that would probably add about 20 or 30% more pages to the book and therefore increase the price of the book. And so I appreciate that this is a very niche product with not a mass audience in the same way that like a coffee table book about the Beatles might sell more copies. And so I would rather that this book exists and that it's affordable than have it, you know, super fancy and all that. I understand. It's just I wanted to get that critique in there. I think it's also important to, despite the size, it's important to keep in mind that it is a reference manual. That's what it says. It's a reference manual. It's for geeks like me, and it's not a coffee table book. I mean, I'll put it on my coffee table, but it's not something with high glossy pages with like beautiful, vibrant color photos where the content is really thin, but the aesthetic is really appealing. The content is really thick and there's tons of content, and that kind of brings down the overall aesthetic, and that's okay because it's a reference manual. The final thing I'll say about this that I forgot to mention when we were talking about the pros is just how readable it is. When I pulled it out and I saw the size and I saw like just the sea of text and I saw that this was basically a textbook, I was getting flashbacks to college and having to do those overnight readings and cramming. And I thought that this was going to be a slog to read, even though I'm a big fan of the band. It's not laid out in the same way that these lovely magazines are laid out in full color with lots of different breaks for the eye and big zoomed up pictures. But I'm actually surprised at how readable it is. And I'm plowing through this book wicked fast. I think it's a fantastic book. I'm really enjoying reading it. And you know when you love a book so much, and I was this way with Phil's book, and I was this way with Mike's book as well, and I was this way with these magazines, but when you are dreading getting to the end, that's a great book. And so I'm like, just finished the chapter on We Can't Dance, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm getting too far into this book already, and it's going to be over soon. And I think that's the telltale sign of a great book. So congratulations to Alan. This is a fantastic book. And if you are watching this channel and if you're subscribed, thank you. Please subscribe. If you're not, But if you're subscribed to this channel, then this is something that you should own. And I hope that one day somebody does this for Phil Collins. I think that would be great to have. But this is a great book for all you Genesis fans. I've put a link in the description. It's the first thing you can click on right away. Go to Amazon and grab that book. And one of the reasons why I think all of us should get this book is to help promote the future of Genesis, and in this case, on this channel, Phil Collins content. The future of Phil Collins and Genesis content, I think, is really important. So the more we buy books like this, the more publishers will take notice, and the more authors will create more legacy books like this for all of us to enjoy. So I think it's really good to support this author and to support books like this. So check the link in the description and make sure you check out this book. Thanks for watching.